Welcome to Phenomenon Radio, the show that covers thought-provoking breakthroughs in the fields of UAP UFOs to discover fascinating truths, first-hand accounts, and investigative insights into the expanding confluence of physical and mental exposure to this worldwide phenomenon. Hosted by Emmy award-winning investigative journalists, Earthfiles reporter and editor Linda Moulton Howe, and world-renowned experiencer of the 1980 Rendlesham Bentwaters incident, John Burroughs. And now, leading off tonight's program, here's Linda Moulton Howe.
Back in the early 1980s, after the production of my TV documentary about worldwide bloodless animal mutilations that law enforcement said were the work of, quote, creatures from outer space, close quote, I got a call from a man who identified himself as an engineer from Aerospace Corporation, Martin Marietta. The man said he had information that was linked to my investigations of animal mutilations, UFOs, and ETs. He came to my Denver office and said in the 1970s, he had worked on a construction project in Sedona, Arizona, in which a small brick building without any windows was built at a specific latitude-longitude on the outskirts of Sedona. He sketched for me a technology. He said it was placed inside the small brick building that was designed to counteract a natural collapse in magnetic fields at that specific location. The magnetic field collapse, he said, would open up a gateway or portal in the fabric of space-time. He said non-human intelligences in this universe and beyond in other dimensions can use such magnetic field collapses to move point to point, compressing light years of distance to a few minutes. But what could come through those gateway portals from another dimension might not be a friend of humans. Now, recently on September 4th, 2018, investigative reporter George Knapp at the Channel 8 I-Team in Las Vegas tweeted that the 2007 to 2012 funding for the Department of Defense Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, known as ATIP, had been canceled by, quote, a cabal of religious fundamentalists worried that studying UFOs will bring Satan into our world, close quote. That Satan connection to UFOs and non-human intelligences that George Knapp referenced has been studied deeply by renowned Nazi history investigator and author Peter Levenda. Peter is also collaborating with To the Stars founder Tom DeLonge to produce a nonfiction trilogy entitled Secret Machines, Gods, Volume 1 of Gods, Man, and War. The second and third nonfiction volumes in the Secret Machine series will be released over the next couple of years. Peter Levinda says the 3-volume nonfiction series begins in Volume 1, Gods, about suspected ancient encounters of humans with very advanced beings from somewhere else in the cosmos. Those encounters changed humankind to a cargo cult, motivated by a desire to imitate these advanced beings, the gods, both in religious rituals and in scientific endeavors. Then in Volume 2, Man, there is focus on the scientific discoveries of the past 100 years that have reflected humanity's desire to fly in the air and blast off to the moon and outer space, and to understand our origins and the structure of reality. Volume 3, War, explores the implications of human contact with non-human intelligences in terms of knowledge, the potential for cooperation, or war. Peter Levenda's revelations about magic rituals and UFOs opening portals so alien so-called gods can enter our planet to make genetic creations is also the thread that weaves through a new fiction trilogy that Peter Levenda is producing. His first book in his fiction trilogy came out in 2016, entitled The Lovecraft Code. The next and second book of the trilogy was released in July 2018, entitled Dunwich. That's the name of a fictional town in Massachusetts used by American writer H.P. Lovecraft in his 1928 short story, The Dunwich Horror. That subject was a very strange, hideous-looking, but precocious child born to an albino mother. If a hybrid, what was the father? Peter looks through the lens of his extensive research into magic and sexual rituals and the UFO human abduction syndrome around the world. He connects complex layers of human obsession over the centuries with magical rites. He presents magic as technology used by outside sinister forces to open up dimensional gateways so that human procreation can be used to create alien human hybrids for reasons unknown. And the only way to stop the abuse of innocent human beings is to block the portal gateways between other dimensions and our planet. Peter evolves his brilliant nonfiction and fiction trilogies from real-world evidence that an alien presence has been interacting with Earth for thousands of years, harvesting genetic material and manipulating DNA to produce already evolving primates that include Homo sapiens sapien and include alien human hybrids. The first two books of Peter Levenda's fiction trilogy, The Lovecraft Code and Dunwich, are both available now at Amazon.com, as well as the nonfiction with Tom DeLonge, Volume 1 of Secret Machines, Gods, Man, and War. After this short break, Peter Levinda will join us on Phenomenon Radio to help us understand both the nonfiction and fiction themes of magic rituals used to open portals for alien gods to enter our planet.
Thank you, Linda, and you're listening to Phenomenon Radio, live on the KGRA digital broadcasting station. Tonight's special guest, Peter Levinda, will join the show right after these messages. Welcome back to Phenomenon Radio. To start tonight's interview with special guest Peter Levinda, here's Linda Moulton Howe. Linda?
Oh, thanks, Peter Levinda, for joining us again on Phenomenon Radio. I think this is your third guest, and everyone says you are one of the most brilliant and articulate guests that we have. So thank you for being here today.
Always my pleasure, Linda.
Well, I would like to start out with sort of making the landscape as big and wide for you as possible to begin with, and then you can unpack this. And the question comes from my having been reading your nonfiction first volume, Gods of the Secret Machines trilogy for To the Stars, and getting into your own brilliant fiction trilogy, Dunwich, about magic rituals that have been used by humans for so long to try to touch the unseen, whether it's angels or devils or whatever. So, Peter, do you think that President Harry Truman and his advisors deliberately chose the acronym MAGIC, spelled MAJIC, for their highly secret Majestic 12 UFO study group back in 1947, right after World War II, because of what the Allies might have learned about UFOs in their clashes with Hitler and the Nazis and their flying discs and the Foo Fighter lights?
Well, I don't know where to begin. I would like to say that I don't know where the magic term originated. I know that's been around now for quite some time. I don't know who came up with it, who individually or specifically did, but there's a kind of a consistency between the idea of a Truman Magic Committee or Magic 12 Committee and what happened only 5 years later in 1952 when General Sanford was trying to address the problem of the UFO overflights in Washington, D.C. And he kept referring to biblical precedent. He kept on talking about the Bible. He talked about the paranormal. He talked about all of these other issues rather than the possibility that there was some kind of secret weapon flying over Washington. He avoided that and instead spoke about these very strange esoteric and spiritual ideas in a press conference, an official press conference happening in response to those famous July 1952 UFO flights over Washington. So there was this idea somehow, and I think you mentioned this right at the very top of the program, that even ATIP was defunded because people felt that somehow dealing with UFOs was opening a way for the devil to get into the world. I mean, there's this idea that if we're talking about UFOs, UAPs, we are simultaneously talking about the darkest fringes of religion and esotericism and the occult. And I think that magic is probably a pretty good label to slap on all of this, because magic has multiple meanings itself. It's a multifaceted term. A lot of people hear magic and they think of sleight of hand. They think of prestidigitation. They think of misdirection. They think of all the things that happen on stage with stage magicians, making you look in one place while the real effort is taking place somewhere else. And that's a pretty good description of how we deal with the UFO phenomenon, with people talking about the impossible stuff on the one side, whereas the real information and the real activity of the UFO UAPs are happening a little bit off screen or out of frame, as it were, and the government trying to deal with it using a different system than they're using to talk to us about it. So magic from that point of view has a lot of resonance. But also the original idea of magic was of really advanced human beings who had access to powers or abilities or insights into the nature of reality that the rest of us did not have. The three magi, for instance, who visited Jesus after Christmas, during the Epiphany in Christian and Catholic religion. So you had these three wise men, the three magicians from Persia, maybe Zoroastrians, who went on a trip to find Jesus using astrology and astronomy to pinpoint the exact location of the manger. So you have that idea of magic. You have Goethe's idea of Faust, the magician who conjures the devil, Mephistopheles, in order to obtain power and love. So you have this idea that we're trying to manipulate reality, that reality is manipulatable. And I think that is really at the heart of all of the new science and the new attention being given to the UAP UFO phenomenon. This idea that our reality is being manipulated right in front of us, and how are we supposed to respond to that?
And if you go back to Jack Parsons, the first director of the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, and the famous stories about his working with magic, the Whore of Babylon was one of the rituals that he did with some young woman trying to access, at least some people said he was trying to access the Aleister Crowley lamb being, that he wanted the being to come out of the magic ritual so he could meet an extraterrestrial.
Well, the Jack Parsons story is a lot more nuanced. He was, as you mentioned, he was one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. In fact, they used to say that JPL met the Jack Parsons Laboratory. He was that identified with the Jet Propulsion Lab and with our fledgling rocket industry, our rocket science. He was a typical ultimate rocket scientist. And at the same time, he was a magician and an occultist, and he was a follower of Aleister Crowley for sure. So here you have these twin ideas of science on the one hand and occultism on the other, which I talk about in Secret Machines Gods, for instance, the idea that science and religion are both aspects of one really human desire, which is to understand reality and to get off the planet. So in Parsons, you had both of these ideas in one human being. And the rituals that he conducted out of the Mojave Desert, at the same time that he was involved in the rocket business during World War II and just after World War II, those rituals were intended to incarnate actually an ultra-terrestrial or an extraterrestrial, at least a non-human entity in human form. And that's what Babylon meant to Jack Parsons. Babylon was a kind of goddess figure in the Aleister Crowley religion of Thelema. And the idea was to incarnate Babylon in the real world. So you're talking about opening some kind of gate or door between this world and the next to allow this non-human entity to incarnate, literally become human in flesh in this world. And that's what Jack Parsons was up to. And it wasn't with a young woman. It was with L. Ron Hubbard that these rituals were conducted, the man who would later go on to found Scientology. It's a fascinating part of our history, and it's part of American history. It's part of who we are, and yet we kind of sweep it under the rug because it's just too weird to contemplate.
But Peter, Admiral Byrd, Richard Byrd, when you think back and all of the reading I have done about when he was asked to do a mission to Antarctica, it seems, looking back through the lens of Adolf Hitler, looking back through the lens of all of the discussion about whether Hitler had extraterrestrial help, allegedly from beings that claimed they were from Aldebaran or Aldebaran, however you want to pronounce it, and his obsession with blonde, blue-eyed Aryans, that he wanted to populate the world with them, and that there were always these implications that he had some kind of technology or the final doomsday weapon, and that Peenemünde was that far northeastern corner of Germany, that peninsula, where even a document that was discussed by a man I interviewed when he worked for the CIA and had been on a mission at Langley in one of their underground archives with his boss at the CIA. They were looking specifically for documents between the UK and the US going back to the 1920s. And he said he read with his own eyes, and he thought the date was 1927 or 1921, that the last number could have been a 1 or a 7, and that it was from MI6. And we didn't have even an OSS back that far. It's the precursor of whoever would have been in the War Office. And that it was a request to the United States asking, do you have information about the silver discs? He said that was specifically the words, silver discs rising up out of and descending into Peenemünde.
Okay.
So with that as background about if there was truth to that, that would mean that in Germany and the efforts of Hitler, that he was, what did he have silver? Did Germany have silver discs that far back?
Not in the 1920s. That was during the time of the tremendous post-war problem in Germany, where everybody was pretty much broke and the government had no money, and they were forbidden because of the Versailles Peace Conference to even have an army or to build up a military presence. Engineering was at a kind of an all-time low as well. And Hitler himself, I think in 27, he might still have been in Landsberg prison because of the beer hall putsch, or maybe that was just a little bit after he got out. But at any rate, just putting all that into context, as far as silver discs, of course, we had, the Foo Fighters during World War II. We've had a silver disc situation in the world long before, 1947, as we know. There was the Nicholas Roerich, the famous Russian mystic and artist, who was a friend of our Vice President Henry Wallace at one time, who actually had a UFO sighting around that time during his trek in the Himalayas. So there's this, the silver discs have been around. Whether they're associated directly with Peenemünde or not is another story. I don't know about that document, so I really can't address it directly. But as far as Hitler himself, Hitler had a fascination with occultism when he was a young, impoverished artist in Vienna. He was reading a lot of occult literature, sort of tabloid stuff that was being produced by a guy who ran something called the Order of the New Templars. He had a magazine called Ostara, and this was all about occultism, not about UFOs yet, because that really wasn't a thing so far in the 1920s and 1930s. But he did write stories about occultism and about different races battling for control of the planet. This was the kind of stuff that Hitler was cutting his eye teeth on in those years just before World War I broke out. So we're talking, 1914 or so in Vienna, before he joined the army to fight. So he already had these ideas. But the person who really put those ideas into practice, into overdrive, was Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS eventually. And he formed an organization called the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Research Department of the SS. And they went around the world, the whole world, looking for evidence that there had been an ancient race of tall, blonde Nordics who had once been more or less in control of the whole planet until some disaster happened and they lost control. And now it was up to the Nazis and the German Reich to bring back this racial purity. And one of the reasons was an advisor to Himmler called Weistor, or Villegut, to use his real name, believed that only if you had racial purity, in the German sense of Aryan, Nordic, Teutonic racial purity, could you bring back the paranormal abilities that used to be part of the birthright of the Aryan race. This is all sort of mythology. There's absolutely no evidence for any of this, but this is what they believed. And they believed that a pure Nordic person would actually have enhanced psychic capabilities as well.
And what was the event that was supposed to have wiped out the tall, blonde, blue-eyed Aryans?
Well, it was a series of things, and one of the rationales given by Himmler and the people who advised him was intermarriage, procreating with the inferior races, quote unquote. So if you had, in fact, that rule, that concept became a rule, became a regulation in the SS. The idea that if you slept with a member of the quote-unquote inferior race, and that meant Jews, gypsies, all sorts of other people, that you had then become impure, and that you were bringing that impurity back into the ranks of the SS where it would infect other people. So if it was discovered that an SS officer had slept with a Jewish woman, as an example, he would be in terrible trouble. He had just polluted his bloodline and possibly was bringing back that pollution to the rest of the unit. So this was handled very harshly. There were laws against this. You could not do it. And not only have children with, I hasten to point out, it's not a question only of having children with someone of an inferior race. It was actually just sleeping with them was enough to cause this impurity to happen and for you to lose your power as a member of the Aryan race. And remember, to be a member of the SS, of this high elite organization within the SS, you had to prove that you were Aryan, quote unquote, you were Teutonic, you were pure German, going back to the year 1750. So you had to actually demonstrate your racial purity first. That was a given. And then you were closely monitored to make sure you did not bring impurities into that bloodstream.
And didn't Hitler and his group and organization talk about some kind of historic link between those Nordics and Antarctica?
Not Antarctica necessarily, but a frozen waste in the north called Thule. We have to go back to the very origins of the Nazi Party in the Four Seasons Hotel in Munich in the days just after the end of World War I. You had the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or the German Workers' Party, was meeting in the basement of that hotel, as well as another group called the Thule Gesellschaft, or the Thule Society. And they had a lot of members in common. And the Thule Society was an occult secret society. And they believed that the Aryan race, the German race, had descended from a frozen wasteland in the north called Thule, and that they all came from there, and that in the old days they ran the entire planet, they were in charge of everything, they were the pure, tall, blonde Nordic types. This organization, Thule Gesellschaft, as I say, had a lot of membership in common with the German Workers' Party. And in 1919, there was a communist uprising in Munich, where the communists were trying to take over the city, as was happening all over Germany after World War I. And to start their attack, they dragged people out of the headquarters of the Thule Society, not the German Workers' Party, but the Thule Society, lined them up against a wall and shot them. And this was on April 30th, 1919. And that was the signal, basically, for a major uprising and a fight between the communists on the one hand and, unbelievably, a secret society on the other, the Thule Society, and all of their allies, including a lot of what they call Freikorps, which were independent militia units that had developed right after the end of World War I. And one of them was the Stahlhelms, and they were people who wore steel helmets, which is what that name means, but they had swastikas inscribed on the sides of the helmets. And the swastika was the symbol of the Thule Society, of that secret society. So you see that the sort of incestuous relationship between this far right German Workers' Party that Hitler eventually would infiltrate and take over, and the secret society involved in magical rituals and weird ideas about race, the Thule Society, was absolute. They were basically the same group, and they used the same symbol, the swastika, as their emblem.
Well, Peter, wasn't the Thule also linking this star, Aldebaran or Aldebaran, to them and to this concept of a pure blonde Aryan race that they wanted to populate the world with?
I'm not sure about any linkages to specific stars by the Thule Society. As far as I know, they were really focused on Thule as this ancient ice-covered kingdom that they once had, that they came out of, sort of the Valhalla of the Teutons, the Valhalla of the Aryans. So it was kind of terrestrial based, but by the same token, if you look at Teutonic mythology, where all of this came from, it was not really specifically on this planet that Thule existed, but somewhere else. They talk about the tree Yggdrasil, which had its roots below the earth, and it had its branches on the earth, and the uppermost branches were in the heavens. So there was this idea of an axis mundi, a kind of pillar that went straight from the earth to the stars. And that might have involved the pole star, the North Star, perhaps, something like that. But we're just not really sure, because it was kind of a mess of mythology that Thule talked about. They had their own form of yoga, for instance, which meant that you had to assume positions that were the same as the runic symbols of Teutonic lore, all kinds of things. There was a syncretic idea to try to mix together a lot of different ideas. So about Aldebaran or anything like that, I'm really not sure. I haven't come across that really in their original literature, although people since then have tried to associate that for sure.
I talked with a psychologist in Delaware in the 90s who was studying the Thule Society and the link to UFOs and to runes and to the symbols that people in the human abduction syndrome are always drawing. And he had books and notebooks showing relationships between what comes out of the human abduction syndrome after missing time, and then comparing them to the runes and to old symbols. And he thought that the tree metaphor that you just described could relate to this whole idea that we now talk about in the modern world of portals and gateways between dimensions.
Well, sure. I mean, it's possible to think of it in those terms. The Nazis sent an expedition to Tibet in 1938 to 39, looking for a lot of the same information. This was an official SS expedition run by anthropologists for the most part, Nazi anthropologists, which is a whole other story. Anyway, so they went up to Tibet and they didn't meet the Dalai Lama. They believe they met the Panchen Lama, and they recorded their visits and all of this. But there was a hidden agenda to what they were doing. And the idea was they wanted to find out, among many other things, what the Tibetans knew about precisely this, about developing paranormal abilities, about communicating with non-terrestrial sources of information. They wanted to know as much as they could about Tibetan rituals. There was this mysticism about Tibet in those days, especially in Europe, and especially among the Germans, that somehow Tibet was this repository of occult power and occult knowledge, and possibly was also related racially to the Germans. There was this idea that maybe the Tibetans were long lost Aryans or something like that, or they had texts, they had ancient scriptures and books and artifacts that would lead the Nazis to suspect that these people had some kind of connection to this ancient race, to Thule, or to the ancient Aryan race, or to some connection somehow that they could exploit the Nazis when they got back to Germany. So it was an extremely expensive and a long expedition, and they brought back a lot of detail, a lot of artifacts, a lot of books, photographs, videos. I've seen a lot of this at Tibet House in New York City. And it's all, it was all painstakingly recorded. Obviously, from the point of view that maybe Tibet was going to be the Nazi connection to this other world, that maybe Tibet itself was the gateway, since the Tibetans have this story about Shambhala, about a hidden mystical city that was only, you could only enter once every few years or at a specific time. It was a Bayul, as it's called, a hidden underground kingdom. And the Nazis were fascinated with this idea because they felt that might have had resonance with their own ideas of the Thule society. So the idea of opening portals and opening gates between this world and the next is very, very, very old. It's not new at all. We're using the term portal now a lot because people have popularized it. It used to be called just a gate, or other terms were used as a veil between this world and the next. You wanted to penetrate the veil of Isis, as Blavatsky called it. So there is this membrane, if you will, that exists between our conscious reality and another form of existence. And magicians and occultists, shamans, and people from various religions, high priestesses, high priests, have always sought to break open that gateway, to go past the veil, to go into the other world and come back with information, from the gods, to come back with paranormal abilities, the power to heal from illnesses, and all of these things. All of that was believed to exist on this other side. And it's that other side where, the gods came from initially, from somewhere else, landed here, and caused this contact between our ancient human ancestors and themselves, which I think there's pretty good evidence that might have jump-started human civilization. This idea that the Shining Ones had appeared at one point from the heavens, from the skies, and somehow inspired us all to try to achieve what they had achieved, and to break open that gate or that portal, to open the veil and to go into that next world.
And it also resonates with modern day whistleblowers who say that on missions, special ops, that they have encountered non-humans deep underground, whether we're talking about 2 miles down in Antarctica. That's one area where there have been whistleblower revelations. Others talk about that there are big caverns under the Rhine surface of the planet in various places, and that an alien presence or presences have used that characteristic of our planet in order to be like in a 2-story apartment. We're on the surface, and that other intelligences have all kinds of places where they have based beneath the surface of the planet in various places. And whether we can't prove it or not, it is a very important question in light of that Martin Marietta engineer who said in the 1970s he was involved in building that brick building in Sedona to counter the natural magnetic field collapse that opened up some kind of portal to something out there. So it is as if we have had government knowledge about portals and magnetic fields and alien presences for a long time, and that we have taken a position of trying to counteract it at some point.
Well, unless you know what's on the other side of the door, you don't want to open the door, right? We don't really know what's on the other side. Our mystics maybe know a bit more than we do. or our shamans no more, the high priests no more. There was a tradition, I mean, even among the Jews, of course, you had the Ark of the Covenant, you had the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could enter one day a year to directly communicate with God. So you have this tradition. It's very old. It goes back a very long time. But there's always this idea that you have to be prepared spiritually, psychologically, perhaps even physically, to penetrate that door, to penetrate that veil, to go to the other side of the Holy of Holies. And that people in general simply are not, particularly not today. There's just not enough spiritual discipline, let's say, to enable people to make that journey and come back and report what they found. So we become nervous about opening those gates and opening those doors. We don't know how to handle the fallout. We don't know what's going to happen. So yeah, we want to keep those things closed until we know what's on the other side. We create little peepholes to try to look across and to see who's standing there on the other side. But basically, we're afraid of that. And we've had disciplines going back to the beginning of recorded history, where certain select individuals, either self-selected, selected by some sort of weird spiritual event that takes place, or simply selected by their own society, are taught how to open that gate, how to go through it, how to experience the other for the benefit of society. And it's really tightly controlled. It's one day of the year, perhaps, as in ancient Sumer, when the king would go up to the top of the ziggurat to commune with the gods, to make that connection. It happens all over the world. It still happens today in some parts of the world where this ritual is enacted. In fact, we've had Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. During that time, Jewish mystics quite often in Central Europe, for instance, would use that very day, the day of the Jewish New Year, to do what they call descend to the chariot, which is an attempt to penetrate to the upper levels of the heavens, to go through the seven heavens leading up to the throne of God, again, to penetrate the veil, to open the gate. This is really standard operating procedure all over the world. When you talk about the underground caverns and the places beneath the surface of the earth, this again has been really consistent throughout all of humanity. In the Mayan regions, you have caves that are considered particularly sacred, where the high priests would go and perform rituals under the earth in the caves. You had the same thing with the cult of Mithra, which was one of the largest, oldest religions in the world until the coming of Christianity in the Roman Empire. And the people who worshipped Mithra would meet in caves, would meet underground, would meet in catacombs, basically, or in specially constructed chapels under the earth, not above the earth, but always under the earth. And Christianity, for the first 300 years of its existence in the Roman Empire, also met underground in the catacombs as well to conduct their religious rituals centered around Christ and the resurrection. So this is a very old and very consistent theme you're going to find in religions all over the place, all over the world, this idea that you must go under the earth to make contact with the gods who exist, outside of the earth or in the heavens. But in order to do that, you have to go under the earth first. You have to descend before you can ascend.
But isn't there this huge, big other issue that comes through the people in the human abduction syndrome of telepathic thought, telepathic inspiration, telepathic control even of humans who have been kept in the dark about the fact that there have been other alien intelligences on this planet, in this solar system, and that humans have been manipulated. For example, the ziggurat. I know in reading about the archaeology investigations back in the 1800s, when there was not the problem of archaeologists and anthropologists getting into Iran and Iraq. And in Budge's work, he talks about how the ziggurat, the way he understood it, was at least one of its functions was for a fair young female on some sort of cycle to go up all of those steps to the little house on top of the ziggurat to have sexual intercourse. And some people have said the ziggurats were constructed, and part of their duty was to be hybridization machines to create hybrids.
Well, I think Budge might have been incorrect as far as his interpretation of the ziggurat, remember when he was looking at it, the cuneiform inscriptions had not yet been deciphered from ancient Sumer. So he might have made some assumptions, but his basic understanding is correct. From what we understand, it was a king, it was a male, who ascended the steps of the ziggurat to meet a female, a goddess. And it was his cohabiting, having sexual intercourse with the goddess, that was enabled his city-state to survive another year, to thrive or to survive or defend itself against its enemies. This sacred marriage, hieros gamos, this idea of a sacred wedding or a chemical wedding, as the alchemists would call it, again, is also very old. And being very old does not mean it's wrong. Being very old may very well mean there's a real meaning and an understanding behind it, because this type of ritual is conducted even today in different parts of the world. There's a ritual like that takes place in Indonesia, for instance. The Sultan of Yogyakarta has to meet the goddess of the southern seas at specific intervals, privately in a hotel room on the beach, outside of, right by the ocean, and no one knows what happens there, what goes on there. But it's necessary for the Sultan to do that to ensure the safety and security of his city. And this is a Muslim country, by the way, and the Sultan is a Muslim title, obviously. And yet this ritual, which has nothing to do with Islam, does take place periodically, at least once a year, on the beach south of Yogyakarta. So there is this idea that there must be some kind of relationship between humans and these non-human entities. And we read about it in the Bible, in Genesis 6. We read about the sons of God and the daughters of men, the Bene Elohim, the sons of God and the daughters of men. And what does that mean? But it was that sons of God and daughters of men relationship that meant that the world had to be destroyed by a flood. God getting really upset with that whole situation. And I've always wondered about that. And I talk about this in Dunwich. Actually, it's a starting off point in that novel, that the sons of God and daughters of men is a very revealing phrase, because why isn't it the daughters of God and the sons of men? Why is the emphasis on the sons of God and the daughters of men? There's this idea that there is a large group of male, yet not quite human beings who are now impregnating human females, not the other way around.
Right.
And the suggestion I make in Dunwich is, where do you find large groups of humans, males only, then molesting, let's say, attacking, impregnating women? You find that in armies. And were the sons of God basically an army? Was it a garrison of non-human, non-terrestrials of some sort, and then, molesting, shall we say, the daughters of men? A very interesting set of circumstances in the Bible that's never been completely translated well enough that we can understand what they really meant. When we go back there, we come across that term, the Nephilim, and there's been a lot of controversy about Nephilim, but I think it means giants, and I believe that what that means is that the relationship between the sons of God and the daughters of men resulted in hybrids that were, in some sense, physically different, physically deformed, which is what we read in the Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. We read a god of some kind during a ritual impregnating a young woman and giving birth to a monstrous hybrid.
And that in Genesis, in some of the translations, the giants that are the offspring of the daughters of man and the sons of God are described as six-fingered giants.
Well, I haven't come across that particularly, but regardless, we're talking about we're talking about something outside of the normal human morphology, no matter what. So according to the Bible as well, when David and Goliath meet, Goliath was supposed to be one of those Nephilim. He was supposed to be one of those giants. He was one of the offspring that had not died in the flood. And according to the rabbis, in one of the midrashim, the midrash, the commentaries on the Bible, let's say, it was Goliath who had the word Dagon inscribed on his chest. And Dagon was one of the Middle Eastern Mesopotamian gods that was incorrectly identified as half fish and half human. Again, the idea of a deformity, a deformed human as a god of some kind, and Goliath himself being a deformed human being in the sense that he was of monstrous size compared to David, who then took him out with his slingshot, as we all know. So the idea that there were hybrids goes all the way back to Genesis 6. And it was the hybrids themselves that seem to have prompted God to become disgusted with the entire human race and want them destroyed, because the Noah's Ark story happens immediately after we learn of the sons of God and daughters of men.
And the half fish, half human was the description and illustration of the Dogon tribe to the French anthropologists, where they had so much information about Sirius, the star and a planet orbiting Sirius. Right.
The whole Dogon thing is worthy of a lot more attention than it's been given. Of course, Robert Temple did a great job of that in the Sirius Mystery. But then he was attacked. His ideas were attacked. Well, somebody knew about it and they told the Dogon. And the explanations for how the Dogon learned of Sirius from, passing French tourists or something is absolutely not credible. So the only credible way we can understand the Dogon is that they had access to information and to a tradition that defies, a human understanding, because the idea is they may have received this information from the Egyptians. The Egyptians may have received it, directly from some non-human source. We don't know. But whatever the Dogons knew, they knew a lot more and in a lot more detail than anybody on the planet at that time. And how was that possible when they had no telescopes? They didn't, there was no way for them to observe the stars from where they were living in Mali. And the whole thing just doesn't make any sense at all. So I think we should really go back and reread the Sirius mystery and reread Robert Temple, but actually go back and read The Pale Fox, which was the start of all this by two French writers who did all the research on the Dogon. There's much more to that story, and it's fascinating. And I do mention it in Secret Machines.
And it does fit into some of the whistleblowers of the last 10 years in the military and intel who say the truth is, and that governments have been, the knowledgeable have been reluctant to open this up, that the truth is there were Anunnaki and Sumerians, and they were extraterrestrials based on this planet, and that the original Greeks, the Zeus and the Titans, that they were extraterrestrials based on this planet as well.
Well, I don't go that far because I don't see the archaeological or genetic evidence for it. But what I do accept is that these stories are memories of things that actually took place. To me, and to people who study mythology and people who study religion, myths don't come first. Events come first, and then myths are written or created to try to explain the event. So you have an event of some kind. You have something that takes place in the real world. And then you have people trying to explain it using the language that they have. And sometimes the language that they have is very poetic, it's very flowery, or sometimes it's very bare bones. But no matter what, it's a struggle to try to describe something for which they have no vocabulary yet. So in terms of the Anunnaki and all of that, I understand about, Zecharia Sitchin and his whole idea, but he did mistranslate some things, and he did get some things, I think, a little wrong. But for the most part, the idea that the planet was visited by non-humans or non-terrestrials, let's say, at some point in our dim past and created, basically our civilizations the way that they are, the impetus, the inspiration for them, I think is true. And the same thing with the Greek ideas about the Titans and all the rest of it. These may be descriptions of actual events that were part of our memory, our ancient memory, something that's been encoded maybe even in our DNA, as we now know that memories can be. So this is we had a traumatic experience as Homo sapiens at one point, maybe 200,000 years ago, or who knows when. Something happened, and we've been going through this traumatic experience ever since then. Just like a trauma survivor, we keep repeating and repeating it. But the essential theme of it is we don't belong here. We didn't come from here. As much as this planet is great, There's something about it that's putting us off, that makes us uncomfortable, and we're trying to get off planet. And whether it's our science or it's our religion, the impulse seems to be the same. Let's do what we can to get out of here. And that seems to be what was behind religion, what was behind magic and occultism, and also these days what's behind science and Elon Musk and everybody else.
And you're reinforcing what people who have investigated the human abduction syndrome have always talked about and questioned. Why would, if they are extraterrestrial biological entities from someplace else in the universe, why would non-humans be coming to Earth and harvesting sperm, harvesting eggs, harvesting all of the genetic material from all of the animal mutilations, unless there was a very intimate relationship between the genetic material on Earth and those which come here to harvest it?
Well, as I point out in Secret Machines, in the second volume, which should be coming out at some point, probably later this year, beginning of next year, we have to share a lot in common with the extraterrestrial entities, whoever or whatever they are. Otherwise, no communication would be possible. None of the abductees' experiences would make any sense at all unless there was some kind of a relation between us. And I firmly believe there is some connection there. The ETs, whoever they are, they may be machines, and maybe what they're doing is they're totally confused by our obsession with reproduction, with sexuality, with falling in love and falling out of love and all the rest of it. This may be incomprehensible to a machine, and maybe they're just desperate to find out what that is. Or on the other hand, maybe we are related more than we know, and they're trying to get to the bottom of it, just like we're trying to get to the bottom of what they are.
And in the Rendlesham Forest incident, which my co-hosts John Burroughs and Jim Penniston were involved back in December 1980, when Penniston had the impression after a hypnosis session that what came into the forest, the black glassy triangle, was a machine from the future, a time machine, if you want to put it that way. And that he had the impression that what had happened is that there is some existential threat far in the future, and that those that are facing the existential threat are related to humanity in some way, and that they have come back in the 20th century in 1980, perhaps the last time the genetic material was healthy enough to gather from this struggling planet, in order to use, and this was his quote, as Band-Aids in a far future, trying to survive.
That's very possible, considering what we now know as far as our science is concerned and the advances we've made just in the last 10 or 15 years. All of these things these are all possibilities that have to be explored, and we desperately need to know more science. We need to know more math, but we also need to know more of our own cultural contexts as well to understand the words that we use and the context that we put these things in. Because as I tell people all the time, as you know, if all you read are UFO books, you're not going to understand this phenomenon at all. So what we need are the inputs from other people, from the experiencers, from the contactees, and also from scientists and musicians and artists and writers, and people from all walks of life, psychologists and psychiatrists as well, people who specialize in consciousness, to help us understand this phenomenon.
And when we come back after this break, let's get into the growing subject and question: are our brains created physically to interact with a quantum universe and quantum consciousness, and not just as an organic, rubbery brain?
Welcome back to Phenomenon Radio, live right here on the KGRA Digital Broadcasting Station. Before we begin hour 2 of our interview with special guest Peter Levenda, it's time for the news, brought to you exclusively by Earthfiles.com. Here's Linda Moulton Howe. Linda?
Hey, Bill, thanks a lot. The National Solar Observatory in Sunspot, New Mexico's Sacramento Mountains is on the eastern border of Alamogordo in Otero County. Since World War II, Alamogordo has been closely linked to Holloman Air Force Base and White Sands Missile Range, which test weapons and rockets for the Department of Defense, as well as for foreign countries. Nearby Holloman Air Force Base occupies more than 52,000 acres and is Otero County's largest employer. 65% of Alamogordo's residents are connected to work at that base. Holloman and White Sands have been intertwined since World War II as a bomber training base with centers for rocket and aerospace research. White Sands has also been the location for the U.S. Naval Air Warfare Center Weapons Division, which now oversees launch operations for suborbital space systems and research rockets. The National Solar Observatory has one of the finest telescopes in the world there in Sunspot. It is called the Dunn Solar Telescope. It was built in '69 and upgraded in 2004 with high-quality optics. At 9,200 feet high on Sacramento Peak, the observatory is about 18 miles south of Cloudcroft. It has a long pyramidal-shaped tower that projects upward toward the sky that is attached to a very large underground base. The telescope helps astrophysicists study magnetism on the sun's surface. So why, on Thursday, September 6th, last week, did the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrive at the observatory, order it closed down, placed yellow caution stop tape at its entrance, and closed down the local Sunspot post office that was located in a private resident's house? It is now September 13th, a week later. As of yesterday, the yellow tape was still at the entrance, the observatory is still closed to the public, and any local resident mail for the estimated 40-some people who live in the Sunspot region is now being delivered to the Cloudcroft post office 60 miles away. And here is the only official statement made by anyone in authority. This was on Friday, September 7th, by Sherry Lifson. She is a spokesperson for the Association of Universities for Research in Astronomy, known as AURA, and they are based in Washington, D.C. Here is the only official announcement. Quote, "The Association of Universities for Research in Astronomy, who manages the Sunspot Solar Observatory facility, is addressing a security issue at this time. We have decided to vacate the facility at this time as a precautionary measure. It was our decision to evacuate the facility." Our was underlined. "I am actually not sure when the facility was vacated, but it will stay vacated until further notice. It's the people that vacated. At this time, it's the facility that is closed." Close quote. As a reporter at the ABC station in El Paso reported, those are a lot of words that say nothing. Yesterday morning on September 12th, I received an email that stated, quote, "National Solar Observatory mysteriously closed as geomagnetic storm looms," and gave half a dozen solar observatory locations ranging from Australia, Chile, and Spain to Hawaii and Pennsylvania. The email implied that there was some kind of organized shutdown of solar observatories, including Sunspot in New Mexico, because of some upcoming storm on the sun. That did not make sense to me, and I got in touch with my trusted colleague and author and our guest tonight on Phenomena Radio, Peter Levenda. I asked him if he could do some searches of the listed solar observatories to see if any were posting shutdowns. He found nothing unusual except for the unexplained closure of the National Solar Observatory in Sunspot, New Mexico. And Peter emailed me, quote, "Closing an observatory does not defend against a solar storm. The American feds can't shut down foreign observatories. So any attempt to interdict data coming from sunspot would be futile because other observatories would start reporting whatever unusual activity they saw. Reports are not controlled by the United States and other countries. Now, there are about a dozen observatories around the world that specialize in solar observations. As far as I can tell, the ones in Asia and Europe are all up and running normally, and that is not counting the space-based telescopes. Close quote, Peter Levenda to me yesterday. The fact that the FBI closed the solar observatory down along with the local residential post office reinforces the growing hypothesis of a national security threat. And by the night of September 12th, various website comments included this one, quote, one theory says Chinese spies were able to set up equipment in the solar observatory and use it to spy on White Sands missile test site, close quote. And it is true that White Sands and the Holloman Air Force Base and the Naval War Airspace, all of that is down right below the 9,200 altitude Sacramento peak, where the National Solar Observatory rests. So it is high right above those very sensitive installations. But as of this Phenomena radio broadcast tonight, on Thursday, September 13th, 2018, no one anywhere that I have been able to find has received any official explanation for the growing question, why did the FBI close down the National Solar Observatory and Post Office in Sunspot, New Mexico on September 6th, 2018? This is Linda Moulton Howe. Please stay tuned to Earthfiles news updates on KGRA Radio and visit every day my science, environment, and real X-Files news website, earthfiles.com, for more on breaking stories about our universe, this solar system, and the planet we live on.
And thank you, Linda. And that is the news brought to you exclusively by Earthfiles.com. Now back to the interview with tonight's special guest, Peter Levinda. Here's Linda Moulton Howe. Linda?
Thanks, Bill. And Peter, before the break, I was thinking in terms of a new press release from an article in Nature magazine, and it was dated August 29th, 2017, not that long ago. And the Nature article is very complex, but the subject is, as in the title, quote, anesthetic alterations of collective terahertz frequency oscillations in tubulin correlate in the brain is basically what this is about. That they have found with very specific terahertz frequency in this research that has been reported in Nature. And it will cause anesthesia, and it says these are blocks of consciousness and blocks of memory while sparing non-conscious brain activities. This was an article that John and I and others, we shared with each other to talk about, one, could it relate to missing time in the human abduction syndrome? Could it be that non-humans know how to use terahertz frequencies, or they are emitted from technologies by non-humans in the human abduction syndrome and would cause an anesthesia of the mind that could be translated into human abductions as missing time? Or jumping over to the work that I know you are so familiar with of Roger Penrose and Hameroff, in which they are trying also to come into the idea of consciousness, a quantum universe, quantum consciousness, and the structure of the human brain being somehow related. And the common denominator in both the New Nature article and in the Penrose Hameroff work are microtubule structures in our brain. Can you take this and come at it from your point of view on the human abduction syndrome, missing time, all the way to the questions that are rising more and more? Are we quantum consciousness entities?
Well, that's a mouthful, and I'm going to try to go through it step by step because this is a very exciting field of research, because it blends two things that nobody really thought much of blending together or connecting together, and that's quantum mechanics on the one side and neurobiology on the other side. And the pioneers of this, going back to the 1990s, were Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. Stuart Hameroff is one of the authors of the article you mentioned on the anesthetic alterations of collective terahertz oscillations in tubulin, et cetera, et cetera. He's one of the authors of this. He's one of the co-authors. And this is in 2017. He was a co-author with Roger Penrose back in 1994 of articles showing that there is a quantum effect taking place in our brains, and that he actually traced, both of these eminent scientists were able to trace the actions, the quantum effects, to a part of the brain called the microtubules, as you mentioned. And what are the microtubules? The microtubules are basically the skeletal material of the neurons. So if you imagine the neuron as a kind of body, the microtubules are the skeletons, the cytoskeleton on which the neurons are built. So they form a kind of lattice work, a kind of matrix through the entire brain. They communicate microtubule to microtubule. They communicate with proteins, and it's a long explanation. I won't go into it. But basically, what happens is the microtubules are so small that their effects are really on the Planck scale, which means they're down at the quantum level. The size of the microtubules is measured in angstrom units, really, really, really tiny entities that are communicating with each other and set up networks through the entire brain.
And Peter, isn't this the important part? Terahertz frequencies that we are doing research on in the bismuth, magnesium, zinc layered, that's a metal. And terahertz frequencies, because as you go higher up in frequencies, automatically the wave of the terahertz goes down into the atomic and subatomic types of dimensions.
Well, that's jumping ahead a little bit. What we have to know about the microtubules in the brain is that Hameroff and Penrose, before the terahertz discoveries were made, were already certain that quantum effects were taking place on the brain. Now, this is something that was hotly contested because it was believed until recently you could not get a quantum effect. You could not get quantum mechanical effects happening. The particle wave stuff would have to happen at extremely cold and extremely dry temperatures. So you'd have to have an environment that was super cold and super dry before you could actually observe quantum effects. Recently, this was proven to be wrong. Photosynthesis, for instance, is a demonstration of quantum mechanics. And photosynthesis happens in our daily life. It happens with sunlight, with photons being transmitted into energy in plants to make plants grow. We all know about photosynthesis from high school. It was proven a couple of years ago by researchers in Singapore and elsewhere that photosynthesis is a quantum effect. That opened the gates for all the rest of this research because it said that you can get the quantum effects in normal ambient temperature and humidity. So the terahertz radiation that we're talking about in this article and elsewhere is the frequency that happens in between the infrared and the microwave. It's sometimes used as a kind of an X-ray to see things that are hidden in physical substances, to bring out just the way an X-ray would. Not as good as an X-ray, by the way, but pretty good. And it will show you, structures that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to see.
And Peter, you're talking about terahertz frequencies that we
Yes.
know we pass through and put our arms up in airports. Those are terahertz frequencies because they
Right.
can look through the cloth for anything metal or whatever the frequency is major to.
Right. So it's used, has a lot of uses, and that's one of the ways it's used today. What Hameroff and his co-authors discovered was that the microtubules can be turned on and off in the brain with the right terahertz frequency. And this is astonishing. He was trying to figure out how anesthesia works. Hameroff is an anesthesiologist. That's his whole life. And that's how he came to the study of consciousness, because he couldn't figure out how an anesthetic works. It didn't make any sense. You give somebody a certain drug. This drug goes to only very specific parts of the brain and kind of shuts them off, leaving the rest of the brain functioning. He didn't understand, and to this day, we don't understand how that works. What we do find out, though, is that these anesthesias that are applied to the brain generate an electrical charge. They generate a frequency, and the ones at the terahertz level are the ones that are responsible for shutting the microtubules on and off, or stopping their transmissions, which then gets to the question you opened with. And I'm sorry I had to take that long way around, but it's important to know all the moving parts. If someone could transmit a terahertz frequency at the brain at the right frequency, you would conceivably be able to shut off parts of the brain that are conscious while leaving the rest of the brain in control of the unconscious functions like breathing and heart rate and all the rest of it. It doesn't shut off the whole brain. It just shuts off those parts of the brain that feel pain or those parts of the brain that are conscious. Sometimes when you're going into surgery and you get anesthesia, if it's not a local anesthetic but a general, you're out. So you have, in a sense, a kind of amnesia. When you come to after the surgery, you don't have any memory of what happened while you were under. That's the whole point of the anesthesia. So is that the same thing as missing time? Is that the same thing as someone being bombarded with a terahertz frequency from some kind of device to erase their conscious awareness of what's taking place, what's happening to them at that time? And then eventually that frequency is shut off, it's reduced, and the person comes to, and they have the phenomenon that we know of as missing time. We have missing time all the time if we go into surgery and we're under general anesthesia, right? That's missing time. We know what happened, or we think we know because the doctors tell us what happened, but we have no conscious memory of that time. So we have missing time every single day in hospitals around the world. So is it possible that this same function, this same phenomenon can obtain with the right terahertz frequency generator on the human brain? And is that what is happening to the abductees?
Yes, and what do you think?
I just read them. I don't explain them, you know.
Well, if one of the major interfaces between a mysterious intelligence and Homo sapiens sapien humans has been going on for at least a century and probably for millennia, that's the human abduction syndrome. We just heard about it for the first time in '61 through the Betty and Barney Hill case. But the common denominator is the missing time. And it can be as subtle as a woman that I interviewed who looked at her speedometer in her car because she had seen a police officer and she wanted to make sure that she wasn't going over the speed limit. She remembered looking at the needle at the number. And then the only next memory she ever had was she saw the needle blur, the number and the needle blurred. And she was still, she didn't know why. She didn't know what had happened. It led to eventually dreams that led to a hypnosis session. And in that strange blur were something like 2.5 hours of missing time with non-humans. So could terahertz be used to temporarily put the brain on hold in the one section, and that would explain how non-humans affect missing time?
Well, one of the things that seems to be pretty consistent is that people who report missing time are also reporting the existence of machinery in the environment. In other words, the UFO or the UAP. There will be this consciousness or this awareness of some kind of unidentified flying object, a machine, and then there's the period of missing time, and then you come to, like Benny and Barty Hill. They saw machines. And these machines, these secret machines as we call them, do they emit that specific frequency deliberately? I mean, if you have missing time and you have a machine, pretty good reason to believe that machine is causing the missing time. And how would they do that? They could do that by emitting a specific frequency that basically shuts down the conscious part of the brain.
Question, Peter.
Yes.
Sorry. During the break, I gave you a synopsis by somebody who's done some research into this, and part of what they were talking about, the military possibilities of it, to include remote viewers, maybe be involved in the plasmas and what's being seen. What is your take on all of that?
Well, I was reading over that excerpt, and I have no problem with any of it. I mean, if you're a remote viewer, let's go back then a little bit back to the microtubules, because what Hameroff and Penrose are saying is that our consciousness is created at the quantum level in the brain by the microtubules, by some function of the microtubules in the brain. So their vibration or their action in the brain is what causes consciousness. Consciousness arises as kind of an emergent property, let's say, of the microtubules. Or conversely, consciousness already existed, and the microtubules, like radio receivers, are picking up consciousness and analyzing it, translating it, picking the station that we like. Let's put it that way. So if you're a remote viewer, your remote viewing is using parts of the brain that most of us don't normally use. So we're going into regions of the brain that are tapping microtubule networks that have been dormant or have simply not been created yet. And through our training as a remote viewer, and I've talked to people who've done remote viewing, for the government, for instance, they train themselves to enter a certain type of meditative state, a certain type of state where they can move their consciousness away from their body to other points in space and time, as Ingo Swann used to say. So that alone automatically implies that there's a kind of an entanglement between your brain, your specific brain as a remote viewer, and the place that you're remote viewing. Somehow your consciousness winds up there. Now that's only possible if we go by Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose's ideas about this sort of malleability of consciousness and the role of the microtubules in our individual brains to control it. So we're actually able to move parts of ourselves to those places. So, can they be perceived? Your author, the person who wrote this to you, was talking about another person being able to perceive the presence of the remote viewer as a kind of plasma ball, if I'm understanding correctly.
Right.
Wouldn't that be possible? I mean, it should be possible. Maybe not as plasma the way we understand it, but as some kind of an entity, as something that's there floating around, in your general proximity and basically spying on you.
So let me ask you something then. When they do that, their consciousness leaves their body.
Well, it's not the entire consciousness. They don't suddenly become unconscious. Consciousness is not one thing. We can divide it up, right? So we can be conscious of, in fact, I write about this in the second volume of Secret Machines. You can be conscious of what's going on right in front of you, but also be conscious in everything that's going on around you you're not focusing on. So attention and consciousness is not the same thing. So if you are attentive, for instance, I'm in a room where I'm staring at the screen where my Skype connection is, and I'm very focused on that little square in front of me. But I'm also very aware of all the books and all the shelves around me. I'm just not concentrating on them. So consciousness is kind of bifurcated a little bit, right? My consciousness is like a lot of things happening all at once, but my attention is only focused on what I need to know at that particular time. A remote viewer is shutting out, in my case, for instance, all the books around me, shutting out the environment completely, and in fact, even shutting down the screen in front of me and moving someplace else. But I'm still in the room, and when push comes to shove, I'm right back there, fully conscious.
But how then would you be able to appear? Okay, here's what I'm trying to understand. He goes to the future, right? Or I'm not, sometimes they could view a facility in another location, right? Which would be right. Present or whatever. They could go to the future. And they take their mind and they go to that location. So what part of them, is there a piece of their energy that's going there to see this? And if you saw that, it would be some of their own energy, correct?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, because you've asked a number of things in that one question. One of them is the idea of time, past, present, and future. Past, present, and future are properties of consciousness. They're not properties necessarily of the real world without our consciousness. You know, in math, you can go in either direction. There's an equation, there's an equal sign, 1 + 1 = 2 is the same as 2 = 1 + 1. It's the same thing backwards and forwards. But in consciousness, there is a before, during, and after. There's a past, present, and future. We create this idea of time with consciousness, number one. So what happens? What actually moves? That's the big question. That's the question that Hammeroff and Penrose have been asking, and other scientists since then. They're talking about the idea that maybe we're not talking about energy. We're talking about information. Because how does entanglement, for instance, quantum entanglement, we're back to quantum physics again, how does quantum entanglement actually take place? How is it possible? Because it defies Einstein's theory of relativity. Nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. And yet, with quantum entanglement, the speed of light is irrelevant. When two particles are entangled, they're entangled no matter where they are in the entire universe, immediately, instantaneously. A change to one means a change in the other. This has led to the idea that maybe we're not talking about energy anymore. We're talking about information as a kind of particle that doesn't behave the way other particles behave in Einstein's universe.
And the idea that terahertz frequencies, that when John was in so much trouble with his heart, and we've talked about this on the air, that Kit Green and Hal Puthoff shed more light about the DI-55 Condign report that the UK had done between 2000 and 2006. It was classified UK secret eyes only. And that in there were a lot of various evaluations on relationship of what they called unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP or UFO, emitting frequencies that could, one, manipulate human minds, and two, damage human bodies. And those words are in the Appendix F of that big 460-page report. And in that context, the definition of what those frequencies were given to us by Kit Green and Hal Puthoff were terahertz frequencies. And that range of the terahertz frequencies that we're all only becoming familiar with and still don't understand. And physicists today don't have the ability to build the machines yet that can generate some of the higher terahertz frequencies. We're running into that in the bismuth, magnesium, zinc research. So I guess comes down to me, what if terahertz frequencies are the cosmic frequencies that get or instigate or do something interacting with organic tubules?
Well, they do. We know that now. I mean, the article that you mentioned at the very beginning demonstrates that at least what we do know is that they have this anesthetic effect on the brain. They can shut down parts of the brain. The terahertz frequencies are measured during the anesthesia. So when a person gets the anesthetic, they can measure the frequencies taking place in those microtubules that have been affected, and that's at the terahertz frequency. So we know that happens. And if that's taking place, what is the degree, what is the level of quantum entanglement? You know, what actually is going on? How are these memories then stored? If your brain is shut off and you have missing time, does that mean that your consciousness does not record anything at all? The other parts of the brain that are not shut off, is there a memory function where the memories are there, they're just not retrievable, right? Except under certain specific circumstances, like, for instance, Betty and Barney Hill, who had no memories or no clear memories until hypnosis was able to unlock some of these memories. And then that became problematic because, you know, how much was the influence of the hypnotist? Was there an entanglement taking place there, you know, between his brain and his microtubules and theirs? I mean, at this point, we don't know the degree that happens, but we do know one thing. And one thing is that many contactees, and abductees in particular, will always say, not always, I don't want to make generalizations, but they often say that after the abduction experience, that they are in constant contact or being monitored by the beings that abducted them. There's this idea of a relationship between the two, as if they are being monitored as if they have a tag on them. Wherever they go on the planet, they will be found, and the abduction experience will take place again, no matter where they move on Earth, they will be found. Is this something that has to do with the kind of entanglement we're talking about? If the microtubules are the location in the brain of quantum entanglement for consciousness, then are we being tagged that way? Do they have this knowledge that we as yet don't have, that we're gradually approaching, though we're getting closer and closer? Can they, using a terahertz frequency, not only give us this experience of missing time, but can they also, using the same technology, kind of entangle themselves or entangle part of their consciousness in ours, so they know always where we exist?
Question then, because this is some of the stuff that I've been looking at recently. Number one, okay, if that's going on, would the pineal gland be probably the place where this is taking place?
Possibly. The pineal gland, of course, is the iconic gland for mystics and magicians worldwide, right? It's the third eye. It's all of this. It doesn't have to be in there. I think what Hammeroff and Penrose are really focused on is the cortex, and the actual gray matter of the brain as opposed to the specific gland. But you raise a very important point. Once we start fooling around with the cortex and the neocortex, we're going to have a two-way street between that part of the brain and the glands, the pineal gland, the pituitary, and all the rest of it. What is the relationship then if we start screwing around, with one part of the brain, knowing that the brain is more interconnected than we thought it was, especially now as more research has shown that the brain itself is connected to the skull in ways that we never really understood, that there are tunnels that exist between the physical substrate of the skull and the rest of the brain. All of this seems to indicate we're looking at one complete system. And it may, yes, go on.
Oh, sorry. Isn't it true that the pineal gland has retinal cells in it?
Yes, exactly. In fact, that's what Descartes and some of the other old French philosophers, around at that time, I think, therefore I am. Descartes was initially fascinated by the optical nerve, and the possibility that the pineal gland had optical cells in it was actually an eye of some kind. He thought that vision was really the key to consciousness. This was long before he wrote the rest of his philosophy. René Descartes was interested in vision as the key to consciousness. And as we go along, we find out that people who study consciousness today are always focused on the eye and the optical nerves and how that works, because they think there's something very peculiar about our eye. There's something strange about the eye, if you think about it, and that is that the lens of the eye is not connected to anything. Okay. The lens just floats. There's no blood supply to the lens. There's no nerve supply to the lens of the eye. It just sits there. And it looks like it doesn't belong there. It looks like something that was put there and was not organic.
So, Peter, I want to get because you kind of threw me off a little bit. You said that the interaction people have with the phenomenon, when they have it with this person, their DNA could interact with that person's DNA.
I think that right now, DNA, we know that we're exchanging DNA with other humans all the time. This has become a new focus of genetic science, the fact that maybe there's more genetic exchange between humans than we know. So if there's going to be genetic exchange between us and humans, the idea that there's genetic exchange between us and the others, I think is very real. In fact, I think our DNA came from there. I think Francis Crick was right, So
if that's the case, then that would be, because that's one of the studies that Nolan's looking at is DNA. They're looking for the calling card of the phenomenon in the DNA.
And I think it's a good place to start. I mean, I think that contact is going to have biological and neurobiological effects it's going to affect consciousness for sure. And things that affect consciousness affect physiology. And we now know that the experiences, for instance, it was just published a few months ago, the experiences of the father is going to affect the DNA of the child. In other words, when the father, the experiences the father goes through in life, generally, when he is conceiving a child, those experiences, not only the DNA of the father, not just what we think of as the Y chromosome and all the rest of it, but actually his memories and his experiences will affect the child. They will be transmitted to the child, and that is science today. So if that is taking place, you can bet that any kind of contact with the others is going to have some kind of an effect on the genetic code of the contactee or the abductee.
And their children?
And their children. You'd
Okay.
have to pass it on, right?
Well, okay, then I guess I want to ask you two questions then. Number one, before I get into the DNA and the effect of the children, the others, as they like to call them, and they come from somewhere, right? So however they get here and they interact, could they, it's like remote viewing has remote influence. So how does this all tie in with what they could do, what we've learned from it, and how we could influence, say, the future or whatever else?
I'm not sure I follow. I think we don't have really enough information to answer that question yet.
Well, supposedly the program within Stargate, they were looking and working on remote influence also.
Sure.
So would that come from whatever we're dealing with?
Well, if I make a telephone call to somebody on the other side of the world and they pick up, I'm influencing them. If they don't pick up, I'm still influencing them. The phone is ringing, they hear it, and they refuse to answer. I'm causing a change to occur in their consciousness on a very vulgar sort of, practical material level. If I'm remote viewing someone in another part of the world, it doesn't have to be a different time. Let's just say it's the present time. And I'm there and I'm looking at what's going on, and I'm getting like Ingo Swanwood, or Richard Bach, as it turns out, was a great remote viewer as well. And if I'm seeing what's going on and I'm writing it all down, I'm having an effect. There has to be an effect on the receiving end, on the other side that I visited. Well, I have to be able to leave a trace there, whether I want to or not. I must be leaving traces. And I imagine if there's a remote viewer at that location, they're going to be very conscious of being remote viewed by someone else. I think that has to take place on the quantum level, if nothing else. Maybe not on the Newtonian, level that we live in day by day, but on a quantum level, there's got to be some kind of an influence between myself, if I'm a remote viewer, and a person on the other side who is also a remote viewer. If there's no remote viewer on the other side, I'm sure that you leave traces of some kind that could be picked up later, because what is remote viewing anyway, right? We're going to a different place, a coordinate in space and time, and we're going to stand right there and we're going to see what's going on. At some point, some other remote viewer is going to be at that point in time and say, oh my goodness, someone's been remote viewing this location, right? There must be a trace that's left at the very, very least.
And Peter, entanglement is, let's say, the big operating method of this universe. Then every single subatomic particle to atomic particle, photon, and beyond, there is the possibility that everything in this universe is entangled from the singularity.
Well, we've done, when I say we, I mean scientists, not me. We've done experiments where we take specific particles and entangle them so that we can measure the entanglement. So if everything is entangled, we wouldn't be able to conduct those experiments, right? Because we'd all be entangled completely. But on the level of energy, perhaps not. But on the level of information, maybe yes. Maybe that we're entangled in terms of not particles, not waves and particles the way we understand it, not the electrical, the photons or any of that. But if we postulate the existence of an information particle, of a data particle that doesn't obey the laws of Einstein or of Newton, that transcends all of that, the way they're thinking maybe is the reason behind entanglement, then information may be the entanglement field, let's say. It may be purely information, and not boring information like you'd have to look it up on an encyclopedia or something, but information in terms of bits of consciousness, let's say.
Zeros and ones.
Yes. Maybe not even zeros and ones. I mean, there's superposition too. So you could have zeros and ones, combined until there's the collapse of the wave function, and then you get a 0 or a 1. I mean, it's all very, mysterious and quantum mechanically, but it could be more than zeros and ones. There may be a different kind of charge that we're talking about, because we're not talking about an electric charge anymore. We're talking about something that has no mass, which is why it can travel faster than the speed of light, or why the speed of light is irrelevant, because E equals mc squared. If there's no m, then we're not talking about mass anymore. We can maybe, violate Einstein's law. So if it's something that has no mass and yet still exists as information, that may be the entanglement that we're looking for.
So Peter, okay, a couple things. I want to get back to the DNA, but I've got another question first. They're doing this work, and they're looking at warp drive, but terahertz leaves a calling card. So basically, when you find traces of terahertz, whether it's at the site where this encounter took, if they could get there in time to test it, or within a person, that tells them then that they had the interaction with this particular phenomenon that they're looking at. Would that be a fair assessment?
I think so.
So the calling card from the phenomenon is the terahertz itself.
In consciousness, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, the terahertz is the mechanism. It's the vibration that causes, for instance, the anesthesia, right? The missing time.
Right.
It would leave a trace. Information, I mean, the memory of the contact would be embedded in the brain, right? So memories, we now know, are not in one specific part of the brain anymore. We used to think it was one area. Now we know that memories are kind of fluid. They travel across the brain. Different kinds of memories travel differently and are retained differently and are accessed differently. So I think the memory of the contact is something that's separate, from the contact itself. So the contact itself might have been the result of a terahertz involvement with our brain, something shutting us down, something, manipulating our consciousness. Okay. But I think that the traces would be left in another part of the brain, in our memory cells, in that part of the brain which conceals memory, or, at some point in that network of the brain, which is composed of microtubules. Somehow that experience will be retained.
But it also would probably be found in a DNA test, correct?
Well, as I said, now we know that consciousness can have an effect on DNA, and memories can have an effect on DNA. So okay. DNA is going to, react to that, but there may be more to it than that. A DNA effect may not be simply something that was in your brain consciousness. That's like one, that's the information part of what happened. But now there may be direct influence on the DNA molecule. That may be deliberate, or it may be accidental. If it's accidental, we don't know exactly how that happened. If it's deliberate, it could be because whoever's causing it understands DNA well enough to interfere with the molecule, to take things out they don't want to be there. Now we're going back to, the hybrid idea and messing with the DNA of a human being to create, a human alien hybrid, that whole concept going back to the Bible. So is there actual direct manipulation of the DNA by someone or something else?
Okay, because the reason why I'm asking is this.
Yep.
You said that the father, and I'm using this in broad terms right now.
Right.
So you have a male that's out and has contact with this phenomenon, right?
Right.
And two things happen. One, if there's an interaction, some of their whatever it is DNA could interact with this father's DNA.
Right.
Okay. And there could be a calling card left there, including terahertz. Would it, number one, change the father's DNA, whether purposely or non? And what then effect would that have on the offspring that the father has?
Yeah, I think that the father is going to be affected by the contactee or the abductee experience for sure. It's going to leave traces in consciousness, and as we now suspect, it may leave traces in DNA as well, because we now are understanding more that even the DNA molecule itself operates on a quantum basis, right? So quantum entanglement happens at the DNA level. And there's been a lot of papers published in the last few years, and I can send them to you, as to how the DNA and the quantum effects are also related. So we're really talking about a quantum effect that's happening in consciousness and in DNA simultaneously. So now you're going to pass on that experience in some way, shape, or form to an offspring. Now, that doesn't mean the offspring is going to have memories of being abducted. It's nothing that Hollywood, right? But it's going to be some kind of an effect. The DNA that's passed on will show traces, I believe, that's what they're trying to say now, will show traces of that contactee experience. It's going to be passed down. There's going to be something that's retained. If your DNA is affected, and for instance, the Y molecule, let's say because you're a male, the Y molecule is affected, and I wrote about this in Dunwich, that's part of the storyline of Dunwich, that the DNA is going to be bizarre, because if you're a hybrid, for instance, if you were if you were conceived as a hybrid, hypothetically, then the Y chromosome, sons of God, daughters of men, again, the Y chromosome will not be human, in the sense that it won't have it won't be derived from any of the haplogroups that we have on this planet.
Holy crap. So in other words, there'll be no heritage.
There will be a heritage, but it won't be a human one. Not from the father's side. From the mother's side, yes, right? If the mother is human, we're assuming. So the mitochondrial DNA, all of that's going to be fine. It's going to be the same. It's the paternal side that's going to have something a little different. It's going to be affected. And if there is a hybrid,
let me ask you hypothetically, okay?
Yep.
This is
all hypothetical.
I understand. Okay, if the mother and the father, okay, well, first of all, explain how, are you saying the mother and father wouldn't be human in the first place?
No. We're talking about a hybrid, right? So let's say an alien father, for the sake of argument, right? And a human mother. And the mother then becomes pregnant and gives birth to a hybrid. Right? The hybrid looks human, acts human, everything is fine. It has a Y chromosome, everything is there. The problem with the Y chromosome, though, is that Y chromosome could not really be linked to any of the human haplogroups, as they call them, on the planet, right? We pretty much know where all the genes come from on this planet. We can trace them all back to Africa, to parts of Asia. Australia has a separate, line going back as well. We pretty much know where all that comes from. So if it's a hybrid, by definition, the father, if the father is an alien, in this case, that Y chromosome cannot be human. It's got to be off planet. It's got to be a Y chromosome from somewhere else to make that child a male.
Let me ask you this then. If you have a mother and a father, they have a child. The mother and father have heritage, but the child doesn't. What does that mean?
A lawsuit. I mean, I don't know, man. We're getting to some pretty hairy areas here. So okay, you have a mother and a father, they're both human, and now the child gets its DNA tested, and suddenly there's something really weird about let's say the Y chromosome. Let's say this is a male. There's an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. Right. So now the male has a Y chromosome, and that Y chromosome, we don't know where that came from.
Right.
That's a lawsuit right there. But in my novel, Dunwich, I use exactly that scenario to describe, the hybrid situation. A young woman sends, the 23andMe or the Ancestry.com or whatever to be tested for her kids. And the people over at Ancestry are looking at the results and they're saying, oh boy, we have a problem. The Y chromosome, it's a lot smaller than it's supposed to be, and it's already pretty small, the Y chromosome, but it's missing a whole bunch of stuff. And we can't trace the haplogroup to anything on this planet. And that's one of the plot elements in Dunwich. So I go into the description of it in there as to how that would work, and what kind of alarm bells that would ring, and people realizing they're looking at alien DNA.
Why would it be alien? I guess what I'm trying to ask is, say you have a mother and father. There's no doubt that child's been identified. They're both the parents of that child, okay? But the child does not come back with any heritage.
Then your doubt is you say there's no doubt, but there must be doubt if the child has no. When you say no heritage, you mean what exactly? The DNA? There's something wrong with it.
There's no heritage back. There's no connection to, like, say, German, whatever. They have no traces.
There's no genetic antecedent.
That's what I write about in my novel, precisely. No genetic antecedent. If you don't have an antecedent, you have to have, as a human being, you have to show your DNA, both sides, both strands, have to have antecedents. You have to be able to trace it back to, all the way back to Africa, right? To Adam and Eve, to the original, humans.
Right.
It has to be traced to that. If it can't,
yeah, but if the mother and father were traced back to an ancient bloodline, they both had ancient bloodlines. They were traced back to that time frame. But then the child they produced had nothing. What does that mean?
That is not possible, unless, as I say, the child was not really produced by normal conception.
Right.
It's not possible, man. It doesn't work like that.
So
well, we have to talk off air before you hang up tonight.
Call your lawyer.
let me bring up another subject for you guys. You can talk about this later. I have had information that of the imprinted panels that were found at least some of the crashes in the large Roswell region in the late 40s to the early 50s, that I've been able to talk with a physicist who worked on one of these panels in an underground laboratory at Area 51. And he told me that using a very strong microscope, he was able to see coming where the tips of the fingers would go into the panels. And he said they were definitely 6-fingered hands, not 5. There were what we would call fiber optics. I only am using that because I don't know. And that the fiber optics were where the tips of these fingers would go. And he said that they related that the optical fibers went into between 2 skins of the craft in the wall where the fiber optics, and that they realized that these hands to the mind of the being were running the craft. A new wrinkle on this that has just come is that there is a DNA frequency component, that a craft that could be flown with the mind of a being, the DNA frequency molecule of that being is the only one that would activate the panels.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be DNA specific. The pilot would be DNA specific.
I guess that's possible. I mean, we have computers now that you can log on to using facial recognition and things like that. I think it's only one short step from there to having DNA recognition. And if you do have that, if you can digitize DNA that way, then I think using that to control a machine, I think that's not that far in the future.
Well, Peter, we're running out of time, but on that note, I've got one question. If they were doing a study of DNA, and they had some kind of equipment they wanted to activate, would they not want to find the most pure bloodline going back to ancient times that possibly could activate that equipment?
Not necessarily. Again, we're using words that may not have meaning for them the way it has for us. A pure bloodline may mean something completely different to them. They may be looking for something very different, maybe a particular type of modification of the DNA, some kind of special quality that maybe we've bred out or maybe we haven't bred in yet. So anything is possible. I think when you're talking DNA, anything is possible.
And Earth could be a long-time laboratory where more than one alien intelligence has been mixing and matching genes, harvesting them, manipulating DNA in order to create something that is in the hybrid category that we as Homo sapiens sapien either are rejecting as an idea or we haven't learned enough yet to understand the hybrids around us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would go along with that as well. We simply don't know yet. We don't have enough information. We're still in the position of speculating. We still don't know our own DNA very well. We're still experimenting with that. So God knows if they're more advanced or they're advanced in a different way than we are, then anything is likely.
Well, when you have the next book out in volume 2, let's do this again, going into that information, which will be going from gods to man. And the next after that will be war. And we would love to have you come back and dive deep into these other volumes.
I'd love to do that. Let me know.
All right. Bill.
All right. For Linda Moulton Howe, John Burroughs, and Peter Levenda, thanks for listening to Phenomenon Radio. Now stay tuned for 3 hours of Fade to Black with host Jimmy Church on the station that brings you the very best in alternative talk radio on the planet, KGRAradio.com. Good night, everyone.